afternoon. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm the last speaker of this excellent panel, as well as this excellent conference, and I want to compliment Molly and the whole team at the Middle East Institute, Wendy Chamberlain, for putting on such a great event here, and I'm honored to be here. The Deputy Secretary, Secretary Burns, last night described to us and to you why it is we care about the success of these transitions in the Middle East and North Africa. So I won't have to go through that. He did it very well to indicate that the United States does care. We have a lot at stake, we think, in the success of these transitions. So we have begun to think about how we can support those transitions. As Secretary Burns said last night, we have established an office. And my office in the State Department is meant 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year to focus on these three transitions at this point. And now we are talking about Tunisia and Libya and Egypt. And we can hope that these will be joined by Yemen and Syria later on. But for now, we're talking about these three. The U.S. government is focused on how we can materially support and politically support these three countries in their transitions. There are three different countries, as everyone in this room knows, and as you've heard this afternoon. So we can't do the same things in each country. We have to tailor each of our programs for the specific countries that we are dealing with. The Egyptians clearly have already a lot of support from the United States on the military side, as well as on the economic side. So we have to provide the kind of support to civil society, election preparations that we are doing on demand, by demand, that we are demand-driven in our support for these. And so Egypt has that kind of a program. Tunisia, much smaller. We can focus more on the elections that they just had, very successful elections. We coordinated with the EU so that the election preparations, the voter information that we provided in some parts of the country, the EU complemented in other parts of the country. And then Libya, with a lot of resources, a fairly small population, different kind of needs, different kind of requirements that we can help with. And again, we're doing this on demand. So there are security issues for Libya. It's probably the most trenchant concern, and for each of these transitions, they will need security for investors, for individuals, for democratic development. They will need economic growth to support the changes in the democracy institutions that they are instituting. So each of these three will be a different example and will require a different package. The State Department and USAID, we have several USAID representatives here today. We are working on packages for each of these, and it's my office that coordinates the work at State and USAID, but it's also with other donors. I mentioned our work with the EU in Tunisia. The European Union has also established an office, very similar to mine, and we're coordinating very closely as well. There's a non-governmental component of this support, of this to these transitions. It's not just the government, it's not just the international community with the IMF and the World Bank, but it is also the business sector. And many people in this room have already contributed, and we want to help channel, catalyze, support that kind of business sector support for these transitions. Universities. Foundations, non-government organizations. It's a broad range of organizations in the United States that can help, and again, it's because we support it's important to us that these transitions succeed. Secretary Burns last night talked about, mentioned how important these transitions are and compared it to the revolutions in 1989. And many people have talked about the relationship and the similarities and dissimilarities. from an assistance standpoint, from support to the transition standpoint, there are real differences. Two I would highlight. One is there are different levels of resources today than there were in 1989, 1992, and throughout the 90s. We supported the revolutions in Central and Eastern Europe and in the former Soviet Union in a big way with a lot of resources coming that the Congress was willing to provide. And we were doing economic reform, and we were doing democratic reform. We did a lot of security work on securing nuclear weapons. This was very expensive. This was a high level, high focus, very important issue for the United States as well as for these emerging democracies, and we were able to provide the resources to do that. Everybody in this room knows the resources are different today than they were then. We don't have the same level of resources, so we have to think differently. There are different requirements which require different things. I'll come to that in one moment. But the other difference is that the Central and Eastern Europeans, and indeed the former Soviet republics, had a place to go. They had a goal. They had a home. They had the EU, the European Union. They had NATO for many of them. They had a common history with many of these. They had common culture. There had a place that they could that was their guide, that was their home. Much less so in these Middle East and North African revolutions. And these transitions are looking for, we're seeing if there is a mechanism, a framework, a structure that can be used to encourage the reforms that are necessary that we've talked about here this afternoon. Both of these differences, both the difference in resources and the difference in kind of structure, lead us to ask whether or not trade, and we've only talked about trade a little bit here, but I think we can elaborate on that, because trade among the region, among countries in the region, is important, and it's low right now for all kinds of reasons that people in this room understand. But that can be increased and the jobs and the economic growth that would bring could be a major contribution, much more than any particular assistance programs that the international community could provide to these countries. So trade among themselves. Trade with the Europeans. The European free trade agreements, some exist. In many cases, in most cases, they're not particularly effective or useful for the kinds of exports that are coming from the North Africa and Middle East countries. And that might change. And again, in my coordination with my European colleagues, we're going to see what we can do to try to encourage both of us, both the Europeans and the Americans, to open markets. And that leads to, of course, the third. So with the third piece, which is the trade with the United States. We need to open our markets as well. So those three pieces of that, we have a model recently, the Americans have a model that we're using and just recently put into effect in the Pacific countries. And we have this Trans-Pacific Partnership that the United States, along with 7 or 8 other countries in the region, are doing to open markets multilaterally. Maybe there is a model for Middle East and North African countries with Europeans, with the Americans, to open markets that would allow trade to flow and jobs to be created. I'm hoping that we have time for some comments, questions for this, but let me just conclude by saying we do care about where these transitions end up. The problem at this point for us is we're not sure exactly where they're going to go. It's kind of like getting on an airplane without knowing exactly where it's going to land. And the pilot is Tunisian, or it's Egyptian, or it's Libyan, because they are in charge. We're on the plane, and we can give advice, and we can point out landmarks, and we can point out mistakes that we've made, but they are going to decide where they land. And if they land in a democratic place with open markets, with respect for human rights and the ability to move forward on these things, then that's a good place to land. But we're not flying the planes. And so we have to have that kind of humility, but remembering how important it is for us that they land in a good place. Thank you very much.